The morning sun cast long shadows across downtown Phoenix as Maya Rodriguez adjusted her tactical vest and checked her ammunition count for the third time. 6 months had passed since the outbreak began in the remote laboratories of Montana, and what started as isolated incidents had spread like wildfire across the continental United States. The government's initial response had been swift but ultimately inadequate, leaving scattered communities to fend for themselves against the growing horde of infected. Maya, a former Marine turned security consultant, had never imagined she would be leading a group of civilian women in what many were calling humanity's last stand. The irony wasn't lost on her that while the military's male-dominated hierarchy had crumbled under the pressure of coordinating a nationwide response, it was the women in small communities who had proven most adaptable to the new reality of survival. Standing beside her on the rooftop of the abandoned shopping mall, Jessica Thompson wiped sweat from her brow as she surveyed the approaching mass of undead through her binoculars. A former emergency room nurse from Tucson, Jessica had seen her fair share of trauma, but nothing had prepared her for the systematic collapse of civilization. The zombies moved with an unsettling coordination that defied the chaotic shambling portrayed in old movies. These creatures retained enough cognitive function to use simple tools, open doors, and even communicate through guttural sounds that seemed to carry meaning. "They're learning," Jessica muttered, watching as a group of zombies worked together to overturn an abandoned car that blocked their path. Each wave gets smarter, more organized. The observation sent a chill down Maya's spine because it confirmed what she had been reluctant to acknowledge. This wasn't just about surviving random attacks anymore, but about facing an evolving enemy that grew more dangerous with each passing day. The mall had become their fortress by necessity rather than choice, its multiple levels and limited access points making it defensible against the shambling hordes that had overrun most of Phoenix. What had once been a bustling center of commerce now served as a refuge for 43 women and children who had managed to escape the initial chaos that consumed the city. The stores had been converted into living quarters, medical facilities, and workshops where they manufactured weapons and fortifications from whatever materials they could scavenge. Rebecca Martinez, a former high school chemistry teacher, had proven invaluable in creating improvised explosives and chemical deterrents that could slow down or disorient the zombies long enough for the group to reposition or escape. Her makeshift laboratory in what used to be a jewelry store had become the heart of their defensive strategy, producing everything from smoke grenades to acidic compounds that could eat through the thick, leathery skin that seemed to protect the more evolved zombies from conventional weapons. The sound of breaking glass echoed from the lower level, followed by the distinctive moaning that had become the soundtrack of their nightmares. "They found another way in," announced Samantha Williams, a former police officer whose tactical expertise had been crucial in organizing their defenses. She had been monitoring the security cameras they had managed to keep operational using solar panels and car batteries, watching for signs of breach in their perimeter. The zombies had shown a disturbing ability to probe for weaknesses, testing different entry points until they found one that yielded to their persistent assault. "Third floor, northwest corner," Samantha continued, her voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "Looks like they've broken through the barricade we set up yesterday." The news meant they would have to fall back to their secondary defensive positions, abandoning the outer ring of the mall that had provided them with additional storage space and early warning systems. As the women quickly gathered their essential supplies and weapons, Maya couldn't help but think about how much they had all changed since the outbreak began. Jennifer Davis, who had been a suburban housewife and part-time yoga instructor, now moved with the fluid precision of a seasoned warrior as she checked her crossbow and adjusted the knife strapped to her thigh. The transformation hadn't been easy for any of them, but necessity had forged them into something stronger than they had ever imagined possible. They had learned to suppress their fear, to make split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death, and to trust each other with an intensity that transcended their previous lives. The bonds formed in the crucible of survival had created a sisterhood that was both their greatest strength and their most precious possession in a world that had lost almost everything else worth protecting. The approaching footsteps grew louder, accompanied by the scraping sound of claws against concrete that indicated the presence of the more evolved variants they had dubbed hunters. These creatures moved faster than the standard zombies and possessed enhanced senses that made them particularly dangerous in close-quarters combat. "Remember the drill," Maya called out as the women took their positions along the predetermined defensive line. "Aim for the head, conserve ammunition, and watch each other's backs. We've survived this long because we work together, and that's not changing today." The words carried more weight than simple tactical instruction. They were a reminder of the promise they had made to each other when they first banded together, that no one would be left behind, that they would face whatever came as a united force, and that they would continue fighting not just for their own survival, but for the hope that somewhere, somehow, humanity would find a way to reclaim the world from the undead plague that threatened to consume everything they had once held dear. The first wave hit them like a tsunami of rotting flesh and gnashing teeth, but the women of the Phoenix Mall had learned to fight with a precision that would have impressed their former military instructors. Amanda Foster, who had once managed a corporate accounting department, now coordinated their ammunition distribution with the same methodical efficiency she had once applied to quarterly reports. Her voice cut through the chaos as she called out supply updates to each defensive position, ensuring that no one ran dry at a critical moment. The hunters moved with an intelligence that was both fascinating and terrifying, using the standard zombies as living shields while they probed for weaknesses in the defensive line. Lisa Patterson, a former veterinarian whose steady hands had once saved countless animals, now applied those same skills to field medicine as she moved between wounded defenders, applying pressure bandages and administering pain medications salvaged from the mall's former pharmacy. The battle raged for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, each second stretching into eternity as the women fought to hold their ground against an enemy that seemed to multiply even as they cut it down. Rachel Thompson had discovered an unexpected talent for explosives, her background as a demolition contractor's wife having provided her with enough knowledge to create devastating improvised devices that could clear entire sections of zombies with a single detonation. The sound of her charges echoing through the mall had become a rallying cry for the defenders, a signal that they were still fighting, still refusing to surrender to the inevitable. But even as they celebrated each small victory, Maya could see the toll the constant warfare was taking on her companions. Dark circles under their eyes spoke of sleepless nights spent on watch duty, while the slight tremor in their hands revealed the accumulated stress of months spent in a state of perpetual alertness. The zombies' retreat came as suddenly as their assault had begun, leaving behind a scene of carnage that would have broken lesser spirits. Bodies of the undead lay scattered across the mall's polished floors, their dark blood creating abstract patterns that seemed to mock the cheerful advertisements still hanging from the walls. But mixed among the zombie corpses were signs of their own losses: torn clothing, scattered weapons, and bloodstains that belonged to the living rather than the dead. Catherine Brooks, who had been a social worker before the outbreak, moved among the survivors with quiet efficiency, checking for injuries both physical and psychological. Her ability to read people's emotional states had proven invaluable in maintaining group morale during their darkest moments, and she could see the signs of breaking points approaching in several of their number. The discovery came during the cleanup process, when Nicole Anderson was checking the bodies to ensure none of the zombies were merely playing dead, a trick they had learned the hard way during their second week in the mall. Hidden beneath one of the larger zombie corpses, she found something that made her blood run cold: a small electronic device, still blinking with a steady red light. "Maya, you need to see this," Nicole called out, her voice tight with concern. The device was clearly human-made, its sleek design and sophisticated circuitry suggesting military or government origins. As Maya examined it more closely, the implications became terrifyingly clear. Someone or something was tracking the zombies, coordinating their attacks, using them as weapons rather than simply trying to contain them. The revelation shattered their assumption that they were fighting a natural disaster and replaced it with the horrifying possibility that they were actually combating a deliberate act of warfare. The emergency meeting that followed was unlike any they had held before, the usual discussions of supply rationing and guard duty schedules replaced by questions that challenged everything they thought they knew about their situation. Dr. Patricia Williams, a former research scientist who had been working on agricultural genetics before the outbreak, examined the device with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle that could determine their survival. Her analysis revealed sophisticated programming that suggested the zombies weren't just being tracked but were actually receiving instructions, their seemingly random attacks actually following a carefully orchestrated plan designed to drive survivors into specific locations. "We're not just fighting zombies," Patricia announced to the assembled group, her voice heavy with the weight of discovery. "We're fighting someone who's using them as soldiers in a war we didn't even know we were part of." The implications rippled through the group like shockwaves, forcing them to reconsider every aspect of their survival strategy. If the attacks were coordinated, then their defensive positions might be exactly where their unknown enemy wanted them to be. If the zombies were being directed, Then the patterns they had observed and adapted to might be deliberate misdirection designed to lull them into a false sense of security. Michelle Rodriguez, who had been a military intelligence analyst before leaving the service to raise her children, began connecting dots that painted an even more disturbing picture. The timing of the attacks, the specific locations that had been overrun, the resources that had been targeted, it all suggested a campaign designed not just to eliminate survivors but to capture specific individuals or secure particular assets. "They're hurting us," Michelle concluded, her analysis cutting through their assumptions like a knife through silk. "Every move we've made, every position we've taken, it's all been anticipated and planned for." As night fell over the mall, the women found themselves facing a crisis that went beyond simple survival. They were no longer just refugees trying to outlast a plague. They were prisoners in a game whose rules they didn't understand, played by an opponent whose identity and motivations remained hidden in shadow. The comfortable routines they had established, the defensive strategies they had perfected, the very sense of agency they had fought so hard to maintain, all of it was suddenly called into question by the possibility that they had been dancing to someone else's tune from the very beginning. Yet even as despair threatened to overwhelm them, Maya could see something else emerging in the faces around her. A grim determination that transcended fear, a resolve that had been forged in the crucible of impossible odds and tempered by the knowledge that they had already survived more than anyone had thought possible. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new revelations, and new tests of their unity, but tonight they would plan, they would prepare, and they would remind themselves that no matter who was pulling the strings, they were still the ones holding the weapons. The dawn brought with it an unsettling silence that set everyone's nerves on edge, the usual morning chorus of distant zombie moans conspicuously absent from the Phoenix landscape. Maya stood at the observation post they had established in the old department store's upper level, scanning the empty streets through military-grade binoculars that had been salvaged from a National Guard checkpoint weeks earlier. The absence of movement was more disturbing than any horde they had faced, suggesting that their mysterious puppet master was repositioning pieces on a chessboard they were only beginning to understand. Beside her, Angela Martinez methodically cleaned her rifle while keeping one eye on the horizon, her background as a competitive shooter having made her their most reliable marksman when precision mattered more than volume of fire. The weapon maintenance had become a morning ritual for all of them, a meditative practice that helped center their minds for whatever challenges the day might bring while ensuring their tools of survival remained in peak condition. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source when Stephanie Johnson, who had been monitoring radio frequencies on equipment salvaged from the mall's former electronics store, picked up a transmission that made everyone freeze in place. The voice was human, clearly American, and speaking in military code that Michelle Rodriguez was able to partially decode using her intelligence training. "Phoenix Nest is contained and ready for harvest," the voice reported with clinical detachment. "Subjects have demonstrated expected adaptation patterns and are now primed for Extraction Protocol 7. The words hit the assembled women like physical blows, confirming their worst fears while raising new questions about what Extraction Protocol 7 might entail. The realization that they were being discussed like laboratory specimens rather than human beings fighting for survival added a layer of violation to their already desperate circumstances. Dr. Patricia Williams had spent the night analyzing the tracking device with makeshift equipment, and her findings painted an even more disturbing picture of their situation. The technology was definitely American in origin, but it incorporated biological components that suggested a level of integration between human science and zombie physiology that should have been impossible. "They're not just controlling the zombies," Patricia explained to the gathered leadership council, her scientific training barely containing her horror at the implications. "They're enhancing them, creating hybrid creatures that retain zombie resilience while gaining human intelligence and coordination." The revelation explained the increasingly sophisticated tactics they had observed, the way recent zombie attacks had shown strategic thinking that went far beyond simple hunger or aggression. Someone was creating super soldiers from the undead, and the women of Phoenix had apparently been selected as test subjects for this unholy experiment. The decision to abandon the mall came after heated debate, with some arguing that their fortified position was their best hope for survival while others insisted that staying would only make them easier targets for whatever extraction protocol awaited them. Brenda Thompson, whose background in urban planning had helped them optimize their defensive positions, now applied those same skills to plotting escape routes that might allow them to slip away undetected. The challenge was enormous. 43 women and children moving through zombie-infested territory while avoiding both the undead and the human forces that were apparently coordinating the attacks against them. Every route led through areas that had been heavily compromised, and their vehicles were limited to a few cars and trucks that might not have enough fuel to reach safety even if they could determine where safety might be found. The first sign that their window of opportunity was closing came when Samantha Williams spotted movement on the perimeter cameras. Not zombies this time, but human figures in military gear moving with the practiced efficiency of special operations forces. "We've got company," she announced, her police training helping her identify the tactical formations and equipment that marked these newcomers as professionals rather than survivors. The soldiers moved in coordinated teams, establishing overwatch positions and setting up what appeared to be a containment perimeter around the mall. Their presence confirmed that the extraction protocol was already underway, and whatever plans the women might have made for escape were rapidly becoming academic exercises rather than practical options. The trap was closing, and they had perhaps hours rather than days to find a way out. The emergency evacuation began with practiced efficiency born of months of survival training, each woman knowing her role and responsibilities without need for detailed instruction. Children were gathered and prepared for travel while essential supplies were packed into portable containers that could be carried or abandoned as circumstances required. Karen Davis, who had been a logistics coordinator for a major shipping company, orchestrated the movement of people and materials with the same precision she had once applied to managing supply chains across multiple states. But even as they prepared to flee, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that they were still playing by someone else's rules, that their escape attempt was itself part of the larger experiment being conducted on them. The soldiers outside weren't trying to breach their defenses or force an immediate confrontation. They were simply waiting, watching, perhaps curious to see how their test subjects would respond to the pressure of imminent capture. The discovery of the underground maintenance tunnels came from Jennifer Davis, whose exploration of the mall's lower levels had been motivated by her search for additional water sources rather than escape routes. The tunnels connected to the city's storm drain system, providing a potential path to freedom that might not be monitored by their captors. But the route was treacherous, requiring them to navigate through flooded passages and debris-choked corridors while maintaining absolute silence to avoid detection. Worse, the tunnels were known to harbor some of the most dangerous zombie variants, creatures that had adapted to the underground environment and developed enhanced senses that made them nearly impossible to evade in close quarters. The choice before them was stark: face certain capture above ground or risk almost certain death in the tunnels below, with no guarantee that either option would lead to the freedom they desperately sought. As Maya looked into the faces of her companions, she saw the same grim determination that had carried them through every previous crisis, the unspoken understanding that they would face whatever came together, as they had from the beginning of this nightmare that had become their new reality. The descent into the maintenance tunnels felt like entering the bowels of hell itself, the air thick with moisture and the stench of decay that seemed to cling to their clothes and skin with every breath they took. Maya led the way with a tactical flashlight, its beam cutting through darkness so complete it seemed to swallow the light before it could reveal what lay ahead. Behind her, the other women moved in single file, each maintaining contact with the person in front while trying to muffle the sounds of their passage through ankle-deep water that had collected in the lowest sections of the tunnel system. Rebecca Martinez had distributed chemical light sticks as backup illumination, but they were saving those for emergencies, knowing that any unnecessary light could attract the attention of creatures that had learned to hunt in absolute darkness. The children were carried by the strongest members of the group, their natural tendency to cry or call out suppressed by a combination of exhaustion and the instinctive understanding that silence meant survival. The first encounter with the tunnel dwellers came without warning, a splash in the darkness ahead followed by a sound that was part growl and part something else entirely. A vocalization that suggested intelligence and purpose rather than mindless hunger. Lisa Patterson, who was monitoring their rear guard, whispered urgently into her radio that something was following them, matching their pace and maintaining a distance that suggested predatory calculation rather than random wandering. These zombies had evolved beyond their surface-dwelling cousins, developing enhanced hearing and a pack mentality that made them far more dangerous in the confined spaces of the underground. Dr. Patricia Williams had theorized that the constant darkness and limited food sources had accelerated their adaptation, creating creatures that were essentially a new species of undead predator perfectly suited to their environment. The tunnel system proved to be a maze of interconnected passages, maintenance shafts, and abandoned utility rooms that had been forgotten by the city planners who designed them decades earlier. Amanda Foster, whose accounting background had given her an unexpected talent for spatial reasoning and navigation, tried to maintain their bearing using a compass and hand-drawn maps, but the metal infrastructure interfered with magnetic readings while the identical-looking passages made visual navigation nearly impossible. They had been underground for what felt like hours when they discovered the first evidence that they weren't the only survivors who had sought refuge in the tunnels. Scattered belongings, makeshift shelters, and the unmistakable signs of human habitation that had been abandoned in haste. The discovery raised new questions about what had happened to the previous occupants and whether their own journey would end in similar abandonment. The attack came from multiple directions simultaneously, confirming their worst fears about the intelligence and coordination of the tunnel dwellers. Rachel Thompson's explosives training proved invaluable as she deployed flashbang devices that temporarily disoriented the creatures, buying precious seconds for the group to reorganize their formation and establish defensive positions in a wider section of tunnel. But the confined space worked against them, limiting their ability to maneuver while amplifying the effects of gunfire to levels that threatened permanent hearing damage. Catherine Brooks found herself treating not just zombie bites and claw wounds but also the psychological trauma of fighting an enemy they could barely see, her social work background helping her recognize the signs of combat stress that threatened to break their cohesion when they needed it most. The breakthrough came when Nicole Anderson, whose background in urban exploration had given her an intuitive understanding of underground spaces, noticed air currents that suggested a connection to the surface somewhere ahead. Following the flow of fresher air, they discovered a maintenance shaft that led upward toward what appeared to be a storm drain outlet several blocks from the mall. But the climb would require them to ascend through a vertical shaft using maintenance ladders that might not support the weight of multiple people, while leaving them vulnerable to attack from below if any of the tunnel dwellers decided to pursue them. The decision to split into smaller groups was agonizing, but practical necessity demanded that they minimize the risk of the entire group being trapped in the shaft if something went wrong during the ascent. Michelle Rodriguez volunteered to lead the first group up the shaft, her military training making her the logical choice for what was essentially a reconnaissance mission into unknown territory. As she climbed through the darkness, testing each rung of the ladder before trusting it with her full weight, she could hear the sounds of movement in the tunnels below, not just the splashing of their own people preparing for the climb, but the more ominous sounds of creatures that had discovered their trail and were closing in on their position. The shaft seemed to stretch upward forever, each foot of progress requiring careful attention to handholds and footing while maintaining awareness of the growing sounds of pursuit from below. When she finally reached the surface access point, Michelle found herself looking up at a storm drain grate that was secured with a lock that would require either tools they didn't have or an amount of noise that would certainly attract attention from whatever forces were waiting above ground. The sound of gunfire echoing up from the tunnels below made the decision for her, as the women still waiting their turn to climb came under attack from creatures that had finally caught up with their slow-moving group. Samantha Williams coordinated the defense from her position at the base of the shaft, her police training helping her organize fields of fire that maximized their effectiveness while minimizing the risk of friendly fire incidents in the chaotic underground environment. But ammunition was limited, and the creatures seemed to be learning from each encounter, adapting their tactics to counter the humans' defensive strategies. The realization that they were trapped between the locked grate above and the attacking creatures below crystallized into a moment of clarity for Maya. They had been herded once again, driven into a position where their options were limited and their captors could control the outcome of their struggle. Yet even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, she could see in the faces of her companions the same stubborn refusal to surrender that had carried them through every previous crisis, the unshakable determination to keep fighting even when victory seemed impossible and survival appeared to be nothing more than a temporary postponement of the inevitable. The explosion that shattered the storm drain grate came from an unexpected source. Dr. Patricia Williams had managed to create an improvised shaped charge using chemicals salvaged from the mall's former beauty supply stores, her scientific knowledge proving once again that survival often depended more on creativity than conventional weapons. The blast echoed through the tunnel system like thunder, momentarily stunning both the attacking creatures and the defending humans while showering them all with concrete debris and twisted metal. Michelle Rodriguez hauled herself through the opening with desperate urgency, immediately taking up a defensive position to cover the others as they climbed toward freedom. But what she saw on the surface made her heart sink. The military forces that had surrounded the mall had anticipated their escape route, and soldiers in full combat gear were already moving to surround the storm drain exit with the methodical precision of a well-rehearsed operation. The firefight that erupted was unlike anything the women had experienced during their months of zombie combat, the crack of military-grade weapons and the whine of ricocheting bullets creating a deadly symphony that spoke of human intelligence and training rather than mindless undead aggression. Brenda Thompson, whose urban planning background had given her an understanding of city infrastructure, spotted a secondary drainage channel that might provide cover for their escape, but reaching it would require crossing 30 yards of open ground under direct fire from professional soldiers. The irony wasn't lost on any of them that after surviving months of zombie attacks, they were now being hunted by their own species. Humans who apparently viewed them as valuable enough to capture alive but expendable enough to risk killing in the process. The rescue came from the most unlikely source imaginable when a convoy of civilian vehicles roared into the area, their occupants laying down suppressing fire that forced the military units to take cover and reassess their tactical situation. The newcomers were clearly survivors like themselves, but they moved with a coordination and equipment level that suggested they had been preparing for this type of confrontation for some time. Jennifer Davis recognized the lead vehicle's driver as Maria Santos, a former Army sergeant who had been organizing resistance cells throughout the Phoenix area, gathering survivors and building a network of safe houses that could support extended operations against both zombie and human threats. The timing of their arrival was too perfect to be coincidental, suggesting that someone had been monitoring military communications and had positioned rescue teams to intercept extraction operations. The evacuation proceeded with military efficiency as Maria's people provided covering fire while the tunnel survivors were loaded into armored vehicles that had been modified for combat operations in the post-outbreak world. Angela Martinez found herself manning a mounted machine gun, her competitive shooting background adapting quickly to the requirements of suppressive fire as they fought their way clear of the military cordon. The soldiers pursuing them were clearly under orders to capture rather than kill. Their tactics focused on containment and control rather than elimination, which gave the escaping survivors a crucial advantage in a running firefight through the abandoned streets of Phoenix. But even as they celebrated their escape, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that they were still playing by someone else's rules, that their rescue was itself part of a larger game whose objectives remained hidden from the players. The safe house turned out to be a fortified compound built around a former auto repair shop, its concrete walls reinforced with steel plating and its approaches covered by carefully positioned firing positions that could command the surrounding area. Maria Santos had been busy during the months since the outbreak, gathering not just survivors but also intelligence about the forces behind the zombie plague and the systematic elimination of resistance groups throughout the American Southwest. Her briefing revealed a conspiracy that went far beyond anything the mall survivors had imagined, a coordinated effort by elements within the government and military to use the zombie outbreak as cover for a complete restructuring of American society, with survivors being sorted into categories based on their potential usefulness to the new order. The women of Phoenix had been classified as high-value assets due to their demonstrated ability to organize effective resistance and their diverse skill sets that made them valuable for both propaganda and practical purposes. The revelation that their struggle for survival had been monitored and evaluated like a laboratory experiment sent shockwaves through the group, forcing them to confront the possibility that every victory they had achieved and every loss they had suffered had been orchestrated by forces that viewed them as resources to be managed rather than human beings fighting for their lives. Karen Davis, whose logistics background had made her acutely aware of supply chain management, began to see patterns in their experiences that suggested their access to weapons, ammunition, and medical supplies had been carefully controlled to maintain them at a specific level of capability, strong enough to be useful, but not strong enough to pose a genuine threat to their handlers. The psychological impact of this realization was devastating, undermining their sense of agency and accomplishment while raising questions about whether any of their choices had been truly their own. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm them, the women found strength in their bonds with each other and their shared determination to resist whatever forces sought to control their destiny. Stephanie Johnson, whose radio monitoring had first revealed the existence of the conspiracy, now applied her skills to intercepting communications between military units and their mysterious controllers, gathering intelligence that could help them understand the scope of the operation and identify potential weaknesses in their enemies' plans. The compound became a hub of activity as the combined groups of survivors began planning not just for their own survival, but for active resistance against the forces that had turned the zombie apocalypse into an opportunity for social engineering on a massive scale. They had learned to fight zombies, adapted to combat human soldiers, and now they would have to master the most difficult challenge of all, waging war against an enemy that controlled the very systems and institutions they had once trusted to protect them, while maintaining their humanity in a world that seemed determined to strip it away piece by piece. The intelligence gathered over the following weeks painted a picture so disturbing that even the most paranoid among them had underestimated the scope of the conspiracy they faced. Through intercepted communications and reconnaissance missions, they learned that the zombie outbreak had been deliberately engineered as part of a program called American Renaissance, designed to eliminate what the conspirators termed excess population, while preserving selected individuals who could be molded into citizens of a new authoritarian state. Stephanie Johnson's radio intercepts revealed that similar operations were underway in major cities across the country, with survival groups being systematically identified, tested, and either recruited or eliminated based on their potential value to the emerging regime. The women who had fought so hard to survive in Phoenix were just one small piece of a nationwide experiment in social control that made their previous struggles seem almost insignificant by comparison. Maria Santos had been building her resistance network for months, but the arrival of the Phoenix survivors brought new capabilities and perspectives that transformed their small-scale harassment operations into something approaching a genuine military threat. Dr. Patricia Williams' scientific expertise proved invaluable in developing countermeasures against the enhanced zombies, while Michelle Rodriguez's intelligence background helped them understand the command structure and operational patterns of their human enemies. The compound became a training center where suburban housewives learned advanced combat tactics alongside former police officers and military veterans, their diverse backgrounds creating a unique fighting force that combined conventional military skills with the adaptability and resourcefulness that had kept them alive during the darkest days of the outbreak. The first major operation came when they intercepted communications about a planned harvest of survivors from a refugee camp in Tucson, where several hundred people were being held under the guise of government protection while actually being evaluated for their usefulness to the new regime. The rescue mission would require them to travel over 100 miles through zombie-infested territory while avoiding military patrols, then assault a fortified position defended by professional soldiers who had been specifically trained for this type of operation. Rebecca Martinez worked around the clock to develop specialized weapons and equipment for the mission, her chemistry background enabling her to create everything from smoke grenades that could confuse both zombies and humans to corrosive compounds that could eat through military-grade armor and fortifications. The convoy that departed the compound before dawn consisted of 12 vehicles carrying 47 fighters, their mixed composition of soccer moms and former soldiers creating a unique dynamic that emphasized both tactical proficiency and emotional support. Amanda Foster had applied her organizational skills to logistics planning, ensuring that they had sufficient fuel, ammunition, and medical supplies for an extended operation while maintaining the mobility necessary to avoid detection by enemy forces. The route to Tucson took them through areas that had been completely overrun by zombies, requiring them to fight their way through several major infestations while maintaining radio silence to avoid alerting military units to their presence. The enhanced zombies they encountered showed clear signs of recent modification, their behavior patterns suggesting that someone was still actively experimenting with ways to make them more effective as weapons of population control. The refugee camp turned out to be a carefully constructed trap, its apparent vulnerability masking defensive positions and surveillance systems that had been designed to lure rescue attempts into predetermined kill zones. Lisa Patterson's veterinary training had given her an unexpected expertise in recognizing behavioral patterns, and she was the first to notice that the camp's layout was designed more for observation and control than for protection from zombie attacks. The refugees were being held in conditions that allowed for constant monitoring while their reactions to various stimuli were recorded and analyzed, their children separated from their parents under the pretext of educational programs that were actually psychological conditioning designed to create compliant citizens for the new order. The realization that they were looking at a preview of the future their enemies had planned for all survivors added urgency to their mission while reinforcing their determination to prevent that future from becoming reality. The assault began with coordinated strikes against the camp's communication systems and power grid, Rachel Thompson's explosives expertise proving crucial in disabling the surveillance network that would have allowed the defenders to coordinate their response. But the military forces protecting the camp were better prepared than expected, their defensive positions incorporating lessons learned from previous resistance attacks while their equipment included advanced night vision and thermal imaging systems that negated many of the advantages the attackers had hoped to exploit. The firefight that erupted was intense and chaotic, with both sides using the camp's civilian population as both motivation and constraint, the soldiers trying to prevent escapes while the resistance fighters worked to minimize casualties among the people they were trying to save. The breakthrough came when Jennifer Davis led a small team through the camp's water treatment facility, her knowledge of building systems allowing them to access areas that the defenders had considered secure. From there, they were able to reach the administrative buildings where the camp's records were kept, discovering documentation that revealed the full scope of the American Renaissance program and the identities of key personnel involved in its implementation. But even as they gathered this crucial intelligence, the sound of approaching helicopters announced the arrival of reinforcements that would soon overwhelm their small force. The decision to withdraw was agonizing, forcing them to leave behind hundreds of people they had come to save, but the intelligence they had gathered would prove far more valuable than any single rescue operation. As they fought their way back to their vehicles through increasing enemy resistance, Maya realized that their war was just beginning, and the skills they had learned surviving zombies would pale in comparison to what they would need to defeat an enemy that controlled the very institutions and systems that had once defined American civilization. The intelligence they had captured from the Tucson facility revealed a timeline that made their blood run cold. The American Renaissance program was entering its final phase, with plans to eliminate all remaining uncontrolled survivor groups within the next 60 days before transitioning to the reconstruction phase of their new society. The documents detailed a network of facilities across the country where selected survivors were being processed and conditioned, their children separated and enrolled in educational programs designed to create a generation of citizens who would never question the authority of their new government. Catherine Brooks, whose social work background had given her insight into institutional manipulation, recognized the psychological techniques being employed as sophisticated versions of methods used in totalitarian regimes throughout history, adapted for the unique circumstances of post-apocalyptic America. The resistance network that Maria Santos had been building suddenly found itself thrust into a race against time, as cells across the Southwest received urgent communications about the accelerated timeline and the need for immediate action to prevent the consolidation of the new regime. Samantha Williams coordinated with law enforcement contacts who had remained loyal to their oaths, discovering that many police and military personnel were unaware of the true nature of the operations they were supporting, believing they were participating in legitimate disaster relief and population protection efforts. The challenge became not just fighting the conspiracy but exposing it to the thousands of government employees who were unknowingly serving as its instruments, turning them from unwitting collaborators into active allies in the struggle to preserve what remained of American democracy. The plan that emerged from their desperate strategizing sessions was audacious in its scope and terrifying in its implications. They would simultaneously strike at multiple facilities across 3 states, broadcasting the evidence they had gathered while liberating as many survivors as possible before the final phase of the program could be implemented. Nicole Anderson's urban exploration background proved invaluable in identifying infiltration routes into heavily fortified facilities, while Brenda Thompson's urban planning expertise helped them understand the infrastructure vulnerabilities that could be exploited to disrupt communications and transportation networks. The operation would require them to coordinate with resistance cells they had never met, trusting their lives to people whose only qualification was their shared opposition to the forces that sought to remake America in their own image. The first phase of the operation began with a series of coordinated cyber attacks launched by Stephanie Johnson and a network of hackers who had been monitoring government communications since the early days of the outbreak. Their goal was to overwhelm the conspiracy's communication systems while simultaneously broadcasting the evidence of the American Renaissance program to every functioning television station, radio transmitter, and internet connection they could access. The psychological impact of the revelations was immediate and devastating, as millions of Americans learned for the first time that the zombie outbreak had been deliberately engineered and that their government had been systematically eliminating its own citizens under the guise of disaster relief. Military units across the country began reporting communication breakdowns and unit cohesion problems as soldiers and officers grappled with the implications of what they had been ordered to do. The liberation operations that followed were unlike anything the women had experienced during their months of survival combat, requiring them to assault fortified positions while simultaneously protecting the civilians they were trying to rescue and managing the psychological trauma of people who had been subjected to months of conditioning and manipulation. Dr. Patricia Williams found herself treating not just physical injuries but also the mental damage inflicted by systematic psychological abuse, her scientific training helping her understand the neurological effects of the drugs and techniques that had been used to break down the survivors' resistance to authority. The children were the most heartbreaking cases, their natural resilience having been systematically undermined by educational programs that had taught them to view independent thinking as dangerous and submission to authority as the highest virtue. The counterattack came with a ferocity that demonstrated just how much the conspiracy had invested in their vision of America's future. As military units that remained loyal to the program launched coordinated strikes against resistance strongholds, while enhanced zombies were deployed as biological weapons against civilian populations that had begun to question the official narrative. The women who had started their journey as refugees fleeing zombie attacks now found themselves leading a nationwide resistance movement, their hard-won expertise in survival and combat making them invaluable assets in a war that would determine the future of human civilization in North America. Maya stood in the command center they had established in an abandoned military base, watching as reports came in from across the country of battles being fought between Americans who had chosen different visions of what their nation should become. The irony wasn't lost on any of them that the zombie apocalypse, which had seemed like the end of everything they had known and loved, had actually been the beginning of a struggle that would test the very foundations of the principles they claimed to believe in. Karen Davis, whose logistics expertise had become crucial to coordinating supply lines for a resistance movement that spanned multiple states, often reflected on how their small group of mall survivors had become the nucleus of something that might either save American democracy or witness its final destruction. The skills they had learned fighting zombies, adaptability, resourcefulness, the ability to make life and death decisions under extreme pressure, and above all the understanding that survival depended on trusting each other completely, had prepared them for a conflict that would require not just military victory but the preservation of their humanity in the face of an enemy that sought to redefine what it meant to be human. As the reports continued to stream in from battlefields across the continent, Maya realized that their war against the undead had been merely the prologue to a much larger story about the price of freedom and the courage required to defend it against those who would sacrifice everything for the illusion of security and control. The final battle for the soul of America began not with a single decisive engagement but with 1,000 small acts of courage as ordinary citizens across the country chose to stand with the resistance rather than submit to the false security offered by the American Renaissance program. The broadcasts that Stephanie Johnson and her network of hackers had managed to transmit had shattered the carefully constructed narrative that had allowed the conspiracy to operate in shadows, forcing millions of Americans to confront the reality that their own government had orchestrated the zombie outbreak as a pretext for the complete restructuring of their society. Military units began fragmenting as soldiers and officers were forced to choose between following orders and honoring their oaths to defend the Constitution, while police departments split along similar lines as the true nature of their disaster relief operations became impossible to ignore or rationalize. The women who had survived the Phoenix Mall found themselves at the center of a movement that had grown far beyond anything they could have imagined during those desperate early days when their greatest concern had been finding enough ammunition to last through the next zombie attack. Maya Rodriguez stood before a gathering of resistance leaders from across the Southwest, her tactical vest bearing the scars of countless battles while her eyes reflected the weight of decisions that would affect millions of lives. The suburban housewives, former police officers, teachers, and nurses who had learned to fight together in the ruins of a shopping mall had become the core of a command structure that was coordinating operations across multiple states, their diverse backgrounds and hard-won expertise making them uniquely qualified to lead a resistance movement that drew its strength from the very diversity their enemies sought to eliminate. The intelligence network that Michelle Rodriguez had helped establish revealed that the conspiracy's leadership was preparing for a final gambit: the release of a new strain of the zombie virus that would be immune to the treatments and countermeasures that Dr. Patricia Williams and other resistance scientists had developed. The enhanced zombies that had been used as weapons throughout the conflict were merely the testing ground for this ultimate biological weapon, designed to eliminate all remaining opposition while leaving the conspiracy's protected facilities and personnel untouched. The timeline was brutally short. They had perhaps days before the new strain would be deployed, and stopping it would require simultaneous strikes against research facilities, production centers, and command bunkers that were scattered across the continent and defended by the most loyal and well-equipped forces the conspiracy could muster. The operation that followed would later be remembered as the moment when the character of the American people was truly tested, as resistance fighters who had never met each other coordinated attacks with a precision that spoke to their shared understanding of what was at stake. Rebecca Martinez's chemical expertise proved crucial in developing countermeasures against the new virus strain, while Rachel Thompson's explosives knowledge enabled the destruction of production facilities that had been designed to withstand conventional military assault. But the real victory came not from any single tactical success but from the collective decision of millions of Americans to reject the vision of the future that the conspiracy had tried to impose on them, choosing instead to embrace the uncertainty and responsibility that came with genuine freedom. The final confrontation took place not in some dramatic showdown between opposing armies but in the quiet moments when individual Americans chose to help their neighbors rather than report them to authorities, when soldiers laid down their weapons rather than fire on civilians, and when ordinary people decided that preserving their humanity was more important than ensuring their survival. Jennifer Davis, who had begun this journey as a suburban yoga instructor, now found herself coordinating refugee assistance programs that helped millions of displaced Americans rebuild their lives in communities that emphasized cooperation and mutual aid rather than hierarchy and control. The skills they had all learned during the darkest days of the outbreak, the ability to adapt to changing circumstances, to trust each other completely, and to find hope in the midst of despair, became the foundation for a new kind of society that emerged from the ashes of the old. The zombie threat never completely disappeared, but it evolved from an existential crisis into a manageable challenge as communities across America learned to work together in ways that made them stronger than the sum of their parts. Lisa Patterson established veterinary clinics that also served as early warning systems for zombie outbreaks, while Amanda Foster's organizational skills helped create supply networks that ensured no community would face the undead alone. The enhanced zombies that had been created as weapons gradually reverted to more primitive forms as the technology that controlled them was systematically dismantled, though isolated pockets of the more dangerous variants continued to pose threats that required constant vigilance and cooperation between communities that might once have viewed each other as competitors or enemies. As Maya stood on the observation deck of the rebuilt Phoenix Community Center, watching children play in gardens that had been planted where zombie hordes once roamed, she reflected on the journey that had brought them from desperate survivors hiding in a shopping mall to leaders of a movement that had literally saved the soul of their nation. The women who had fought beside her had scattered across the country, each applying the lessons they had learned in their own communities while maintaining the bonds that had been forged in the crucible of impossible odds. Catherine Brooks had established counseling centers that helped survivors process the trauma of the outbreak years, while Samantha Williams trained new generations of community defenders who understood that true security came not from walls and weapons but from the strength of the relationships between the people they protected. The zombie apocalypse had ended not with the elimination of all threats but with the recognition that the greatest dangers to human civilization came not from external enemies but from the willingness to sacrifice freedom for the illusion of safety, and that the price of liberty was not just eternal vigilance but the courage to trust each other even when trust seemed impossible. The undead had taught them how to survive, but it was their choice to remain human that had allowed them to truly live.